This program is made possible by volunteers, supporters, and members like you. So thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for joining us tonight. A quick note about some upcoming programs. Our upcoming programs include a virtual Mehergan Fall Festival on November 1st at 7 p.m. And on November 8th, we have an outdoor concert. For more details, go ahead and check us out on Facebook or follow us on Facebook. Check us out on online on our website. So tonight we have the pleasure of being joined by Dr. Pardis Mahdavi, Dean at ASU. She is the Dean of Social Sciences and the Director of the School for Social Transformation at Arizona State University. Prior to coming to Arizona, she was Acting Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Her research interests include gendered labor, human trafficking, migration, sexuality, human rights, transnational feminism, and public health in the context of changing global and political structures. She has published 4 single-authored books and 1 edited volume, in addition to numerous journal and news articles. Dr. Mahdavi, thank you so much for taking the time to join us tonight to speak on this very timely and interesting topic about the trafficking in the modern era, and the relation between the war on trafficking and the war on terror. Again, a very timely and interesting subject.
Thanks so much for having me. I want to thank everybody for taking time out of what I know is an incredibly busy and also anxiety-provoking time in the world. So thank you for taking time out of your week to be with us tonight. I'm very excited. It's a real honor to be among you. I recently moved from Denver, Colorado about a year ago. And, it's one of the hard things about moving is you sort of lose home and you get very homesick. And finding the Iranian American community has been incredibly important to me and to my family. So thank you so much for welcoming me with open arms. I'm going to talk tonight about the topic of one of my 4 books. Salman was kind enough to mention that I've written 4 single-authored books, 1 edited volume, and then I have 2 more coming out next year. And this book was it was written out of my field work that I had been doing for over a decade with survivors of human trafficking. And subsequent to that, I spent some time in Washington, D.C., and then I was a fellow at Google. So these experiences together gave me a really interesting perspective on how the world sees and talks about human trafficking, and how the world sees and talks about terror, and how the war on terror and the war on trafficking have sort of conspired to castigate certain people as victims and certain people as villains. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to share some slides. I promise to not bore you too much and not talk for too long, and have this be a little bit more back and forth, but I wanted to at least get us all on the same page. And I just need the host to enable screen sharing one more time for me so that I can share that screen. And then
hang in there, just give me 1 second and I'll do that.
And just as a quick note for everybody, we'll be doing a Q&A after Dr. Mahdavi speaks and kind of goes through her slides. We do have 2 alternatives for you. You're welcome to type your questions into the chat box. If you prefer to ask your question live, there is a button down below that allows you to raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, then that allows you the option to ask your question live as opposed to typed. So without further ado,
Great.
Dr. Mahdavi, go ahead, please.
And Salma, can you just confirm you can see my slides okay now?
I can. The slides are up.
Excellent. Thank you much. Okay, so in short presentation this morning, I want to focus on 3 main points. One is the fact that trafficking and terrorism have been misdefined, and I'm going to specifically focus on trafficking and how it's been misdefined both by law and policy as well as in practice. I'm going to look at the disconnect between policies and laws written typically here in the United States and the lived experiences of survivors of human trafficking and people who've survived kind of the prosecutions from the war on terror. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of social justice campaigns in perpetuating or alleviating challenges. Now, why do I make the rubber band analogy here? The way I explain it to my students is that human trafficking, the way in which it's talked about and the way in which policy and laws, so the way in which it's legislated, is kind of like a rubber band. And what I mean by that is that it stretches wide enough to encapsulate everyone in the sex industry, whether or not they were forced, frauded, or coerced, which is the law. But then it shrinks to exclude people outside the sex industry, specifically men. So when I first began to do this work in the early 2000s, it was very difficult for us to get restitution, or for us to even get anybody to take seriously the case of a man who was trafficked. In the United States, we have something called a T visa, and men are, until just recently, had a very, very difficult time accessing that, because the paradigm of human trafficking is very much biased by gender, race, and class. So I'm going to start with trafficking. The definitions of trafficking from the Palermo Protocol, which is the United Nations protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. That's the full name. You can see why we call it the Palermo Protocol. But the Palermo Protocol defines trafficking as the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons by means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, abduction, fraud, deception, abuse of power, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent for the purposes of exploitation. Okay, so really the way we narrow it down is force, fraud, or coercion. So if force, fraud, or coercion were involved, under the United Nations definition, a person would be assumed to be trafficked, right? Now, in the United States, Bill Clinton signed into effect something called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, Congressional Order HR 244. He initially brought it up, but actually it was George W. Bush who signed it into effect in late 2001. And the TVPA defines trafficking as an act to combat trafficking in persons. And then you note this, it says, especially into the sex trade, right? And so as a result of the way in which trafficking is defined in the United States and the way in which what we call the discourse of trafficking has shaped up, the hyper focus is on the sex industry and people outside the sex industry like nannies, beauty salon workers, men who are construction workers. So I did my field work in Dubai and Kuwait and Qatar, and most of those were male workers who had been trafficked into the construction industry. But by these definitions of trafficking, they would not be seen as having passed that litmus test. So the United States Trafficking Victims Protection Act does have a provision for something called a T visa. But in order to access a trafficking visa, which would keep somebody safe until their case is resolved, there's a distinction made between trafficking and severe forms of trafficking. And severe forms of trafficking is defined as trafficking in sex. So only the latter is seen as deserving a T visa. That's until just a few years ago. And so you can see the litmus test is very high. So how do we get to this question of the terror of trafficking? So 2020 marks the 19th anniversary of both the War on Terror, which arguably began after 9/11, 2001, and the War on Trafficking, as the TVPA was signed into effect the same year. Now, when you look at these two, you can see that they're both predicated on what we would call moral panic, right? Panic about certain victims and certain villains without really understanding the nuances of how our laws actually create more problems or create systems of abuse for the people for whom they're meant to protect. Right around the time when you had the War on Terror and the War on Trafficking, you saw a rise of Islamophobia and what some scholars have called the clash of civilizations. And so I take some of those discourses and those tropes to introduce what I call a trafficking and terror paradigm, where trafficking and terror are artificially sutured together without any basis. And so what you would see right after 9/11 and including that whole decade after and up until 2011, people would use trafficking and terror interchangeably. And sometimes the laws on one were yoked to the laws on the other. So both laws conspire to castigate Muslims in particular as the villains, and it's typically Muslim men, and then the victims are typically women, often light-skinned women. So the world is carved up by this war on terror rhetoric into what would be called good Muslims and bad Muslims. And Junaid Rana has added a category called terrifying Muslims, which comes out after the war on terror. But the war on terror is very hyper masculinized, right? So the war on terror is really focused on men as the villains, and it's this very, you know, hyper masculine trope, and it kind of a surveillance apparatus that really focuses on men. By contrast, the war on trafficking, again, coming up at the same time, is the hyper-feminized antidote to the war on terror with an over-focus on women. So like I said, you have these problematic paradigms, the disconnect between policy and lived experience, which is resulting in what many of us call legal productions of illegality, where essentially individuals who are facing abuse are forced into the underground. They're forced into the informal economy because they're not protected by the laws, which are written often to protect only certain categories. So evidence of these sort of victims and villains tropes. I don't know how many of you have seen the film Taken. If you haven't, you want to close your ears. This is going to give you a spoiler alert here, but Taken is essentially about a former CIA agent played by Liam Neeson and his daughter, who is a young white teenager. And she wants to go for spring break with her friends to France, and then she's kidnapped. And in films like Taken, Call and Response, Human Trafficking, surprise, surprise, the bad guys are always dark-skinned men with Middle Eastern accents. And so the very last scene of Taken reveals that his daughter has been taken and she's on the boat of a wealthy Arab sheikh and is about to be sold for her virginity. So again, Muslim men as the bad guys dealing in the flesh of white women. That played into the same narratives around this threat of Islamic peril or the clash of civilizations. So trafficking gender, women in sex work, as I mentioned, were all understood to be trafficked, whether or not they were forced, frauded, or coerced or not. So when I was doing interviews, how I even got interested in this topic, and I should back that up a little bit, I had been working on Iran, and some of you probably are familiar with my work on sexuality in Iran. But as a result of my time in Iran, I met a group of women, Iranian women, who would go every year from Iran to Dubai for 3 to 6 months a year, engage in sex work, and make enough money to support their family for a year or two. And I was interested, and so I began following these women to better understand the choices they made. Now, these women, they did not have pimps. Their johns were chosen by them. And these women would very much not fit the trafficking stereotype. On the other hand, as soon as I got to Dubai, anybody who's been to Dubai knows you get out of the airport, and what do you see? You just see thousands of men in blue uniforms building all these big, tall, beautiful buildings. But the reality is often these men are in chains, they live in labor camps, and they have a very hard time accessing any kinds of rights under labor law or under trafficking law. So when I came back to Washington, D.C., I was doing a fellowship for a period of time, and I was talking about trafficking in Dubai, and the response was, oh, of course, those poor Iranian women, they're kidnapped and tricked. And I was like, what? No. They're making a choice, although they're choosing from a series of very limited options. Let's be clear about that. But these men are often forced, fraud, and coerced. And people at the time, this was 2007, people at the time actually laughed at me for saying a man could be trafficked. Now it's entered the parlance a little bit more. But, you know, women in sex work were labeled as trafficked. Men and women in other industries were labeled as migrant workers. And the question of agency has been very much up for debate within kind of dialogues around forced labor. Particularly, force and choice are seen as two opposing binary structures. And the way I explain it to my students, and this will reveal my age a little bit, but imagine it like a telephone cord. I know many of you have never seen a real telephone, but a telephone cord that spirals. So the way I explain it to my students, if I had a board, I would be drawing this, but people are constantly forced to choose from a series of limited options. So force and choice aren't so much a binary, but rather a spiral that people keep getting kicked into. So some of the policies that I've been looking at to kind of make a broader assessment of how it happened that you have policies so disconnected from reality are the Tvpa, which I mentioned, the Trafficking in Persons Report, which is a global scorecard that the United States puts out every year, ranking all the countries of the world into tier 1, tier 2 watch list, and tier 3. And countries that are ranked tier 1 are doing a great job. Countries that are on tier 2, so-so. And then tier 3 are countries that can be subject to sanctions. But a closer look at the tip, tells you that it's pretty biased. First of all, up until 2014, the United States never ranked itself. So that's a bit of a red flag. But take a look at these tiered rankings. Tiered 1 is United Kingdom, Sweden, Italy, Australia, basically who the US sees as friend. Tier 2, Brazil, Romania, Thailand. I mean, arguably Thailand should probably be tier 3 if you know much about trafficking, but okay, well, we understand how the US views Thailand. Tier 2 watch list, UAE, Philippines, although the Philippines has moved up, Congo, Russia, and then tier 3, take a look at that, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Cuba. So the tiered rankings typically align more closely with who the US ranks as friend and who the US ranks as foe, rather than actual human trafficking issues. Now, the most stark contrast to me is the contrast between Italy being on tier 1 and Iran being on tier 3. Everybody knows Italy has deep organizational crime ties, and there's a lot of trafficking going on in and through Italy, yet they remain on tier 1. Iran, by contrast, actually has very little trafficking. Borders are pretty tight, and they're put on tier 3. Now, I write about this in my book that I was in DC, and I asked a State Department official, I said, why is Iran on tier 3 of the trafficking in persons report? And they said, you know, I don't know, but I think it's just easier to leave them there since they do such bad things anyway. So, you know, that undermines the teeth, right? The strength of something like the TIP report when you have these real opaque rankings. The TIP goes on to specifically make recommendations for countries that are actually exacerbating the problem. So they specifically recommend for the United Arab Emirates, which, as I mentioned, has been on the tier 2 watch list on and off. Now, why is that significant? The United States is one of the UAE's largest trading partners. And so slipping off the watch list to tier 3 and being sanctioned would devastate the UAE economy, right? So the UAE has a vested interest in getting off the watch list and in kind of playing ball, if you will. So the TIP specifically recommends for the UAE tightening borders and increasing the police. At one point, the TIP recommended doubling the police. Now, here's the issue with that. When you tighten borders, but you don't do anything to address why people make these choices, supply and demand of labor, all you're doing is you're actually increasing smuggling. You're making it, you know, people still have a demand for labor and there's still a supply of labor. And all you're doing is you're making it less safe rather than regulating. And then increasing police was a big problem because all of the women I interviewed who had, of all the women who I interviewed who had been raped, 80% had been raped by police. And oftentimes the police are imported and not really trained very well. So this idea of doubling your police actually was doubling the amount of rapes. And I should add that in a subsequent book, I've talked a lot about this, but migrant women in places like Dubai are what I call contractually sterilized, in that they are legally not allowed to have sex or become pregnant while they're in country. And if they're raped and they become pregnant, they're incarcerated. They have the baby in jail, and then they're forcibly separated from the baby, and the baby becomes stateless. So that's the topic of my 2016 book, which is following these stateless young people and the mothers who've been forcibly separated from their young ones. So colliding wars, how is it that the trafficking and terror paradigm has been constructed? Well, you have all these groups like Google, Microsoft, Tribeca Film Festival, and others who kept making a false link. They said that the same people who are involved in terrorism are also involved in trafficking, and they use the revenue from one to pay for the other. A number of studies have been done in the last 10 years, and there aren't any links. So it turns out that this suturing was artificial. And really that this othering process was creating another need for intervention. So when we were, very much involved in the Middle East, people were able to say, well, look at the trafficking and look at the terror. And these were all part of this kind of smokescreen arguments. Now, the lived realities, I've spent 2 decades working on these issues. And in my time, I've interviewed hundreds of survivors of trafficking and hundreds of people who are sex workers or migrant workers or in any number of these categories. And the reality is people have many reasons for migrating, right? Sometimes it's to support families back home. Sometimes it's to be reunified. Sometimes it's to go back and find their, I've been working with a woman who had forcibly had to abandon her baby when she was deported back to Madagascar. And all she wants to do is go back to Dubai and find her daughter. 5 years later. So there are many reasons for migration. Sometimes people do, voluntarily get themselves smuggled, and maybe they consent to the migration, and maybe they consent to the movement, but they often don't consent to the terms of employment. So forced fraud and coercion can really operate in a number of ways. Migrant women are painted either as victims of trafficking or of circumstance. They're thought to be better off than at home, or scheming migrants or duped women. And the reality is it's much more complicated than that. It's none of the above, really. And the problem is that outreach and protection, legal protection, is predicated on fitting the script, which is kind of a faulty script. So I'm not going to go into their stories here, but these are some of my interlocutors. These are 2 construction workers working in a hotel in Dubai. Actually, one of them is no longer with us because he jumped from the construction site, and the one who is squatting down and took his own life out of frustration with his situation. He was from Kerala, which is a state in India, and he did consent to move to work in the construction industry, but he did not consent to living in a room with 8 other men and no bathroom and working 36-hour shifts in 130-degree heat. And I know I can say that in Arizona and you understand what that means. 130-degree heat, 36 hours a day, outdoor, 36 hours at a time, outdoor. On top of all that, these folks were not being paid at all. They were told they were still working off their migratory debts, which, for years at a time. And so out of frustration, this gentleman took his own life because he didn't want to return home empty-handed. He didn't even have enough money to return home. And yet he could not get any kinds of protection anywhere because he was a man and didn't fit your classic trafficking script. By contrast, here's a group of women who would be considered or possibly labeled trafficked because they're a group of Filipino women together walking down the street in Kuwait City. And yes, they do work in the sex industry, but no, they weren't trafficked. Most of them are mothers, and they are working to send money back home to their children or to pay off gambling debts from their husbands. And a number of them were prosecuted when the UAE was trying to just get its numbers up to get a better ranking in the Trafficking in Persons report. Folks were prosecuted and sent home empty-handed. So you have a situation of the men who are not protected by the laws, and then the women who are facing the harsh, side of laws and being deported empty-handed. So really, my work argues that policies have to recognize the interconnectedness of the political economy and how people are forced to choose from a complex set of options. We also have to recognize that the suturing of trafficking and terror is somewhat artificial to the extent that they are not the same networks, but the suturing has come from policies and laws and narratives and media and film that have tried to paint the two as one and the same. Global policies on trafficking are having the opposite of their intended effect. These misdirected energies are actually creating obstacles. So, having the Trafficking in Persons report make a recommendation that's out of sync with people's lived experience creates more problems for them. And if these policymakers and the lawmakers were to actually understand lived experience and to sit down and kind of ground the policy in lived experience, they would actually be doing a lot more to protect the people for whom, they are trying to write these laws. So we're definitely blinded by the micro. We have this innocent victim versus guilty consenting migrant. We have this construction of a savior rhetoric. Everybody loves to feel good about feeling bad, which leads to oversimplified solutions and structural issues that continues to go on. So just to wrap it up, assigning blames for the social ills of trafficking or terror to a particular state or country is neither productive nor accurate. Global policies call for state involvement in stopping sex trafficking without recognizing the larger context structuring migration. And policies are actually having the opposite of their intended effect in that they're creating more vulnerabilities rather than protecting people's rights. So I will stop there. Have I stopped the screen share, Salma?
Yes.
Great.
Perfect. Dr. Mahdavi, thank you so much. It's a lot to take in, very informative. I'm going to kick it off here with some questions, and then once we have some questions from the audience rolling in, of course, we'll turn to that. how much of this, it seems to me like at least a decent amount of the issues you've identified come from sort of our underlying assumptions and problematic views of, gender norms, outdated sort of gender norms. What role does that play, and how much do you think shaping and correcting those underlying norms would alleviate or help at least some of these issues that you've identified?
Yeah, I think you really kind of hit the nail on the head there, Salman, because that is a core underlying problem, right? That a man who wants to get protection under like a T visa is emasculated just for asking for that protection, right? And we have these gendered norms. I worked on some cases of survivors here in the United States, actually, who worked as agricultural workers who had migrated from Mexico and other parts of Latin America. They were working in the tomato fields, and they were being pistol whipped every day by their employer. And they were told, just you even asking for a T visa is unmanly, and they were sort of emasculated, even though very much their situation does fall under the legal definition of forced fraud or coercion, right? They're actually getting all three in that case. And the same goes for women. I think this notion that women can't make a choice, or aren't making these really hard, courageous choices, but rather they're kidnapped, and in this that diminishes the courage and the very painfully difficult choices women have to make too. So I think that these frameworks aren't really doing anybody any good. All they're doing is making people who are already in a bad situation feel worse about themselves.
Have you seen any movement? I mean, you've been studying this issue for a very long time, right? And obviously you're a thought leader on this issue. In the time, in the 2 decades that you've been doing this work, have you seen trends in the positive direction, right? Case studies or examples maybe that you can cite to of things going the way that you think they should in terms of policy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would say a couple of things. I think things are definitely getting better, or at least they were until a couple of years ago. I think, a lot changed after, 2008, 2009. Really, 2011 or 12 is when the US started to rank itself in the Trafficking in Persons report, which is a huge shift. So that was really important globally. In 2014, the US Trafficking in Persons offices around the world made a pledge to work with local groups and local NGOs to actually do more proper data gathering. So that was also really important. Domestically, we've seen the passage of the California Clean Supply Chain Act, which has actually really moved the needle to the extent that any company that's registered in California, for example, has to disclose their supply chain, right? And so if we want to know, let's say if the the vegetables that I bought from Costco, if they're sourced ethically, I can actually go onto the website and figure that out. Now, that was really instrumental when a couple of years ago, a number of us, I was involved, we blew a case wide open of the shrimping boats that were providing the shrimp that P.F. Chang's and Walmart's and Costco uses. And we found out that the people who were actually harvesting the shrimp were Indonesian fishermen who were on a South Korean-owned boat fishing off the coast of New Zealand. And they were working in 40-hour shifts and living at the bottom of the boat, sleeping on top of each other in their, feces, etc. And when we blew that case open in California, we said, look, this shrimp that you're buying at Walmart, P.F. Chang's, and Costco is from these ships, and people boycotted. And as a result, those Costco, Walmart, and P.F. Chang's said, we are not going to source from you anymore. The owners of the boat were prosecuted, and all of the men were given restitution. So that was just a couple of years ago. So that tells me that things are moving in the right direction. It's just, it takes a lot of time, and all you need is a discourse that needs, a villain, and you're right back to square one.
I mean, it sounds like, first of all, that's an amazing case study, and I'm, grateful that there has been some progress on that issue, and that certainly for members of the public, right? I mean, I would imagine most folks wouldn't really have much of a sense of, well, even if I wanted to find out this information, where would I go? How could I find out if the coffee that I buy, or the, what have you, the product that I buy on the
Actually, you
store shelf?
can. Actually, you can. There's a website called Slavery Footprint, and actually you can do that.
There you go. That's what I was going to ask. What?
Yeah.
Okay, well, there you go. Slavery Footprint. That's a good recommendation.
But it's not obviously perfect, and not everybody, any company that's been registered or operates in California, we're able to track, because California passed this law. I'd love to see Arizona pass a similar law.
I agree. I think that would be wonderful. We'll definitely check out Slavery Footprint. I mean, it sounds like, based on your description, though, that these issues are, far more pervasive than perhaps most people would realize, and that many of our products probably are the result of some kind of forced labor, or part of this paradigm, unfortunately, the system.
Yeah, I mean, I think what was so haunting about Taken, is the film, and those series of films, was that they allowed you to continue to think that this is just a problem over there, right? This is a problem of rich Arab men on boats who are, trafficking through Bosnian mafia out of Paris. And thank goodness it doesn't have anything to do with me, unless I send my daughter off on spring break. And I was like, sorry, that's not really what it is, right? That sex trafficking itself constitutes a very small percentage of trafficking, right? And just because the sex industry is much smaller than, let's say, the garment industry, the agricultural industry, the beauty industry, right? Fashion. And so, that we could, content ourselves with feeling good about feeling bad for, the person in Taken, that, unfortunately absolves people from feeling like, well, hey, maybe I should try to figure out, the tomatoes that I buy at, Trader Joe's, where do those come from versus the tomatoes at Safeway? And, people who are committed will do that work. But if you just kind of absolve yourself of this issue, like, okay, well, that's not me. It was really powerful that everybody boycotted P.F. Chang's and Costco and Walmart. I think without that, we would not have won that case. So, the general population has a role to play here.
And that actually pairs perfectly with the question that came up in the chat: is what can an average person do to help? I mean, armed with this information, right? With more information than we had before, what can we do?
I think you can do what California is doing, right? Which is, first of all, push for the Clean Supply Chain Act, so you know where everything you buy is coming from. And do that work. There are so many organizations where you can actually trace your supply. Like, if you want to buy a bag from Kuyana, you can actually figure out who made the bag, like from which village, and where did the leather come from, etc. Like, you can do that work. And yeah, it does take a little bit more effort, but I think the effort is worth it. And I think we're setting an example, for the next generation. In particular, things like fast fashion you're just feeding the beast when you shop at like Forever 21 and H&M. You're just feeding the beast, right? And you can be a little bit more ethical about your sourcing if you want. And then I would say, the average person can help by, getting involved in volunteer campaigns that want to help survivors of trafficking, regardless of if you're man, woman, trans, in the sex industry, not in the sex industry. Right around, between 2001 and 2010, you had a lot of organizations that were faith-based organizations that were really just about like sussing out, the sex workers, and trying to save them and save their souls, and as opposed to really kind of digging deeper and doing the work. But if you can get involved with some of the really powerful work that's happening now, we have a really well-known pro bono anti-trafficking law center where there's a team of lawyers that fight for T visas and fight for restitution for trafficked individuals in the United States. You can support that, or you can just support the research that's helping, uncover the nuances of some of this.
How do you feel, with I mean, the world has changed a lot in the last 20 years in terms of access to information and access to misinformation, right? That, people are we're in a place where we can be in information silos almost, right? We choose the content that we receive and it already confirms what we believe as opposed to opening our eyes to new information. What role do you think social media and sort of these new forms of communication have played in this issue? Have they been helpful? Have they been harmful? Is it a little bit one or the other in terms of, is there a benefit of raising awareness, but perhaps the detriment of, some other kind of detriment?
So let me actually tell you where social media has been the most helpful because I just feel like, as a Gen Xer, my job is always like, the media's ruined everything. But let me actually say where social media's ruined everything. But let me say where I think it's been helpful. I think it's been tremendously helpful in allowing the creation of underground activist networks and underground support networks. It's allowed people to get in touch with each other. It's allowed people to form underground social movements that are pushing back, that are changing laws. That very same sex worker I told you about who's been trying to get back to Dubai to get her daughter back, she's part of an underground group that's actually succeeded in changing the laws in Madagascar to allow white passports, to allow all the women who are in jail with their babies to come home, right?
Wow.
So these underground networks are hugely important, and social media has facilitated this sort of global social movement. So I think that's really important. But you're right, there's a lot of fake news out there and misinformation. And I'm really critical of how the media has represented human trafficking and terror, war on trafficking, war on terror. That said, I think that, it's our job to just keep pushing back against that fake news. And I see it as a dean, it's my job as an educator to teach this next generation how to think critically and how to educate, how to think, and how to be able to sort of sift through the noise and hear the message, right?
Do you have any recommendations on, for somebody who is maybe looking for different sources or to ensure that you're getting a balance that the information that you're getting isn't particularly skewed in one way or the other? I mean, any particular thoughts on how somebody would do that? Maybe somebody right now is only using one news source. Do you have any thoughts on recommendations?
Well, I would say diversify your news sources, first of all. I would say actually in the Middle East, Al Jazeera gives you some great stories and they do their homework. But by and large, it's so, I can't say like the New York Times is this and this other the Washington Post is this, because it's so variant on the journalists, right? Some journalists, I worked really closely with some journalists. They would come to Dubai. I was the first person they would call. I would take them to the camps, so some do a really good job, and some, they come and they stay in a fancy hotel and they write an article without ever going anywhere other than the mall or the beach. So, it's kind of luck of the draw, but what you have to do is, be a critical thinker and look for things. So you're reading an article, look for quotes, not just from the authorities or just from the police, look for quotes from survivors. That's what I would say as you're reading a source, ask yourself, who is the source really getting the information from? If it's just the ambassador or the ambassador on trafficking, well, then you have a bit of a question mark.
Can you speak to, how prevalent sex trafficking is in the United States? I know you mentioned it does get over sort of
it does get overblown, right? I mean, so estimates, and again, I have colleagues like Denise Brennan and Dina Haynes and Martina Vandenberg who work more in the United States. I'm much more, obviously, as you can tell from my presentation, I work much more on the Middle East. So I have a much better sense, but global estimates tell us that of trafficking writ large, sex trafficking is roughly 10%. So you got 90% outside the sex industry.
Wow. Another question that came up is if you could summarize the TVPA, give us another kind of overview of that legislation.
Yeah, so the Trafficking Victims Protection Act is Congressional Order HR 244, and there's a reauthorization which was signed into effect by George W. Bush. So it's the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act. And in that act, the United States sets up provisions for what's called a T visa. Now, just for you to know, the TVPRA has said that we can award up to 5,000 T visas per year, okay? But in the last 15 years combined, we haven't even awarded 5,000. That's how high the bar is to get a T visa. Okay, so because the Trafficking Victims Protection Act makes a distinction between trafficking and severe forms of trafficking, and the latter is much more tethered to sex, it makes it very difficult for the young man that I told you who was pistol whipped for picking tomatoes to be able to access a T visa.
Have there been any, bills introduced in the Congress that we should know about in recent session or current session that would fix any of these loopholes that say if somebody wants to contact their congressperson to push for a particular bill to fix some of these rather large problem areas that you've identified with the existing law?
Yeah, well, so if any of our listeners are in Colorado, yes. If any of our listeners are in California, yes. Unfortunately, in Arizona, no. But at the national level, we have introduced domestic workers protection acts, and what some anti-trafficking lawyers are doing are using employment law. They're able to kind of use employment law in really powerful ways, but or some are using domestic violence laws. I mean, people are having to get really creative, as you can see, when they shouldn't have to, right? Because the whole point of creating a framework like trafficking is not just to spin people into a moral panic, but at the core, it's supposed to be to help people who are in such a bad situation rather than harm them.
We have another question coming in from Facebook. Could you repeat the name of the organization where you can find out, I guess, if the workers in a supply chain of a product that you might buy are abused?
Yeah, so Slavery Footprint is what I think that's the one they're referring to. But if you live in California, the California Clean Supply Chain Act mandates that every organization that's registered in California have to put their supply chain on their website. So if you're in California, you can actually go any group. Let's say you want to buy your kids' uniform shirts from Gap. You can actually figure out if they're registered in California, you can get their whole supply chain.
How much of, there's been a lot of talk about, I'll use the phrase because that's the common phrase, illegal immigration, right? And attitudes towards immigration generally, frankly, seem to have been shifting perhaps significantly in the last 10 years in a whole variety of ways. I guess how would you say those kinds of shifting attitudes about migration, immigration, illegal immigration generally, how has that impacted what you do and the kind of the work that you do? I mean, are people perhaps more receptive to this, less receptive? Are they, are attitudes changing as a part of that broader shift?
Yeah, I would say that there have been periods of time where people were deceptively receptive, if I might. And what I mean by that is that there was definitely a period of time where trafficking was used, by ICE, and to say, look, we've got a raid, we have to have an ICE raid here because this could be a trafficking situation, and we've got to get everybody and send them out. And so there were a lot of ICE raids in the name of trafficking. But again, and then that's where you got all this footage. There are organizations that have got footage of ICE like going in and pulling women out, dragging women out by their hair, saying you're a trafficking victim, but like they're pulling them out by their hair. If this is a victim, what's going on here? But so in the name of trafficking, people have definitely become more receptive.
This question is coming in our chat also, a question specifically about sort of, this one relates to selling arms to the United Arab Emirates. But I guess first I'll ask you about the UAE, and then if you think that a similar thing applies to some of our other allies. I mean, do you think that there are cases where, the United States puts other interests ahead of these kinds of interests, right? I mean, if we are able to sell arms to the UAE, for example, does that mean that we turn a blind eye, or we kind of take our foot off the gas in terms of, pushing for reforms or helpful, more things that actually would be helpful, changes over there?
Yeah, I mean, I'm imagining that whoever asked this question is probably familiar with the 123 agreement. So there was a case in the UAE where, so the UAE had thought that they had done a lot of good work to improve the trafficking situation. They were thinking about reforming their guest worker, which is the kafala program, the guest worker program. They were going to reform the guest worker program. They were making all this progress. So they thought, surely we're off the watch list this year. And they didn't get put off. They got put back on the watch list with the threat that they would move to tier 3. When they dug deeper on that and asked, why did this happen? This is according to officials who do a lot of these negotiations in the UAE. They said they found out that the United States ranked them lower because they wanted to get a better deal on the 123 nuclear agreement. And so they used the trafficking persons report to get a better deal there. Wow. So again, that really undermines the TIP report could have a lot of teeth and it could be a really powerful instrument. But the United States keeps undermining itself by being opaque in the compilation and by doing things like with the 123 agreement.
Has there been any more movement, at the United Nations in recent times, sort of to address some of these issues? I know that often, well, there are different critiques, shall we say, of various UN organs. But could you, I guess, speak to? Let me first start here. Could you speak to the arm or organ of the United Nations that is kind of focused on this issue, if there is one, and if there's been any kind of progress globally in terms of action at the United Nations?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked that question because I didn't get to mention it in my presentation because I was going so fast. But the Trafficking Persons Report, or the Palermo Protocol, sorry, not the Trafficking Persons, the Palermo Protocol, is based out of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, UNODC, which many of us have said is a very curious place for a human rights document. So why is it that the Office of Drugs and Crime is the office that's, people who are used to dealing with drug trafficking? Why do you think that, they're going to be able to protect the human rights of individuals? So why is it in UNODC has been one critique. The other critique is the Palermo Protocol has in its title, this is the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children. Why those last 4 words? Why especially women? Obviously, and this gets very academic, but people have said that there's this constant repetition of women and children, which is very condescending and infantilizing to the point where it's women as children, which further takes away agency. Which, that is an argument that I can see. My bigger issue is, why did you have to do that? You just cut out half the world's, what are all the men who are being trafficked, right? So just even having that in the title, having this be located at the UN Office on Drugs and Crime is not the most ideal setup for something that's supposed to be about promoting human rights.
Some more chat questions. Oh, this is an interesting one. Where does the United States stand on the list since we started ranking ourselves? Where?
We're always tier 1.
Wow. And do you care to provide any thoughts on the accuracy of that assessment?
I mean, we're being taped, so no.
Okay. So, we've talked a lot about sort of the legal frameworks, the political issues, I guess, and we touched on this a little bit at the beginning, but I kind of want to divert back this way oh, actually, I have it. It looks like we have one other question. Here we go. What is the size and magnitude of human trafficking globally? If you could generalize, the number of victims and/or dollar amounts, I guess, value of services that are rendered by trafficking, I suppose.
I would love to. And if anyone ever gives you that number, please call me first.
Okay.
Just because it's so far reaching, right? And there are so many instances of people who are in situations of forced fraud or coercion who don't come forward, can't come forward for whatever reason, have been silenced. So it's very hard. I mean, we can, talk about numbers of cases that have been prosecuted, but like I said, with the T visas, we're at such a low number with the T visas and prosecution. By the way, I should say that, like, survivors who want to get restitution either in the United States or globally, I mean, it takes years, and they have to constantly, people say that they become professional witnesses. They're like on the stand day in and day out, telling their story over and over, re-traumatizing themselves. And the legal process can be incredibly brutal. I respect lawyers because I know it's so much. So not all, I mean, I'm glad that there are people like you out there, because, you know, I've been in court with women and children, and, you know, with women and their children, trying to fight for custody of their children. And it is brutal, you know, so I can see why folks, you know, give up or decide, I don't want to be prosecuted. Or you have folks who just don't trust the law, right? They've been burned in, you know, various situations. And so they more trust the underground networks. So it's pretty complicated. There was a question earlier that said, do I think trafficking comes because people don't have a good income and need money? I mean, certainly the political economy is at the heart of a lot of this, but let me give you an example of how this is globally connected. So the United States is where the World Bank and the IMF are located, right? So the Philippines has been in debt to the World Bank and IMF. Now, the IMF and World Bank have created what are called structural adjustment programs, SAP, structural adjustment programs. In the case of the Philippines, their debt repayment program is tethered to migrant remittances. So what that means is that the Philippine government has a more vested interest in sending its citizens, and in particular women, because women remit more than men. So the Philippine government has a more vested interest in sending its Filipina women abroad than in finding jobs for them at home, because they need to pay back the debt that's in the structural adjustment program that was designed here. So what does that mean? Today, 50% of kids in the Philippines are growing up without their mom. Why? Because of structural adjustment programs that don't allow for their moms to be employed at home. So their moms are around the world taking care of other children. So it's a globally networked phenomenon.
Well, I guess to kind of build off of that question, what role related, coming in our chat again, what role do you think financial institutions can play to disrupt human trafficking?
Well, for starters, how about we not have debt repayment be tethered to migrant remittances, so that countries have a vested interest in keeping their citizens home and finding jobs for them at home, right? I mean, so that they're not vested in sending them offshore, where, let's be honest, as soon as a citizen leaves their home country, their rights are diminished by being in a host country. So that's a huge role that financial institutions can play. We can also do a lot of restructuring, like like clean supply chains. Financial institutions could predicate lending on having clean supply chains. There's a lot of different things. And also, I will say, to credit financial institutions like JP Morgan Chase, a lot of the trafficking work that has been done, where we have been able to do prosecutions, have come from partnerships with banks who help us with like credit card statement and figure out like who's making what charges at what hours and to what beauty salon. Like, why are you at the beauty salon at 2 a.m.? And that helps uncover, so financial institutions are really important partners.
We got another question about, are people bought and sold? I mean, we're talking about trafficking and we're talking about forced labor, and, I guess, can you elaborate on, I mean, it sounds to me like that's exactly what's happening, but if you could elaborate on that.
I mean, I guess their labor is being bought and sold. I'd like to be able to grant survivors more agency and dignity, and, because they don't like to be thought of in that way, right? That's a very painful way. If you're a survivor and you hear that, that's a very hard thing to hear. So, I try to be really delicate in thinking about the way my interlocutors frame their situation.
That's a very good point, and a good reminder to, check our own worldviews and frameworks and assumptions, right? When we're talking about these issues. Well, it looks like we have somebody coming on live with a question. Oh, okay. No, we have it typed out.
Dr. Mobasseri is here, and if he,
Dr. Mobasseri, go ahead, please. You're on the line.
Hi, Dr. Mahdavi. This is Barzan. I wanted to, actually, my I think my question is was in the chat, but allow me to ask the following question. Two questions I have. Number one, would you go far enough to say that this unfettered drive for capitalism and makes the labor force be treated like environment and every other thing, so that as long as you have dispensable labor force, then you start kind of in a way treating people this way? And I can fully share your experience in Dubai because I visited there for about a week. And even your Uber driver who's driving in a brand new Lexus has to work for 18-hour days, unlimited, 7 days a week, just to be able to pay for the fees and charges for the car. So it's just like an economy that is built on this. So that's my first question. How much of it do we allocate to the fact that it is if it costs a Nike shoe to be built for $4 and then sold for $200, where is this conscious that we have as far as how can people make it? So that's question number one. And the question number two has to do with the fact that why do you limit this only to across the borders, across the international borders? Because you would have exactly the same type of a problem when you're looking at and I want to give you an example of, for example, in India, when the COVID outbreak took place and all of the transportation systems were shut down, there were people who had to walk for days. And India is no small country. I mean, these people had to walk on foot for 5 days or 6 days with every belonging that they had, just so that they can get back to their country. So if you can comment on these bigger social issue that we have as far as how we handle our problems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions. That's great. On your first question, absolutely. The way in which sort of the political economy, capitalist markets are structured, it depends on a flexible oversupply of labor, right? Which allows that race to the bottom, right? So, and I'll give you a great example, okay? So at one point, there was a period of time where a lot of Filipino women were returning home in body bags from Saudi Arabia. And so the Philippines said to Saudi Arabia, look, you can't do that. You're treating our women, our citizens horribly. You have to pay them equitably. You have to give them a day off. You have, they're miserable. They're killing themselves because, et cetera. And we're going to create this, it was called the Philippines Household Service Reform Package, right? And Saudi said, oh yeah, you're right, absolutely. And they said, we want to raise the minimum wage. And they said, okay. And you know what they did the next week? They turned to Indonesia to recruit for half the price, right? So it's that race to the bottom, right? And that's why I was suggesting in one of my slides, there have to be multilateral policies. So in 2014, 2015, I moved to Singapore so that I could work with ASEAN countries, all the ASEAN countries, right? The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right? So that India, Philippines, Malaysia, that they could all move as a block. And if they move as a block and they all do this, then there are less options, right? So, I think you're absolutely right. And it is cyclical, right? Because so you come to Dubai, you're an Uber driver, you have this Lexus, you have to work to pay it off. And you're just in this hamster wheel, and you don't want to go home empty-handed, right? That's the biggest thing, right? People have dignity. They don't want to go back to their families empty-handed. Many of these folks borrowed a lot of money to be able to travel, let's say from India to Dubai, and they can't go home without being able to repay their debt. So it is this cyclical kind of hamster wheel. To address your questions about borders, absolutely agree with you that it's not across the border. So that's why we say trafficking is forced, fraud, or coercion. You can be trafficked within Phoenix. Like if you live on South Mountain and you're being held or working in a labor camp or in any kind of a tough situation in Scottsdale, that's still trafficking because there's still forced, fraud, or coercion involved.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Salman, you're muted, just as an FYI. Oh, there you go.
Thank you. How do we? I wanted to shift back to sort of some of the underlying cultural issues, and I think maybe we'll take only one or two more questions and wrap it up since we're at 8 o'clock. But, you know, how would you go about changing attitudes, right? I mean, we talked about some of these norms that underpin these problematic worldviews, right? That sort of only feed into this problem. You know, but with this, in this day and age where everybody's kind of choosing their information and hunkering down and reaffirming maybe some of their own beliefs, what would you recommend to kind of get through to some of these folks to help broaden their horizons?
I mean, that's why I write my books. Because I think the power of stories is huge. So I think you can read a statistic and that's just a number. But when I tell you these stories of some of the people I've just been sharing with you, you're going to remember that, right? You're going to remember those stories. And in my book, I bring these people to life in my books. You know, it's like, especially in my, you know, my most recent book of mothers separated from their children, like you meet the moms, you meet the children, you meet them separately. I follow the moms back home. I mean, the idea is to connect with people, you know, that yanks you out of your own lived experience and takes you into a different world. And to realize that actually you have a lot more in common than you think. That sometimes you have some of the same fears, some of the same hopes, some of the same dreams, and yet these are folks who, through whatever circumstance, unfortunate, you know, they have been kicked into these cycles of structural violence, you know, because they happen to be a woman and in the Philippines, and the Philippines wants to send them abroad. This is the situation they're in. But otherwise, they're a mom who wants to feed their kids, you know, it's a pretty basic human need in the human story.
A couple more questions, and then I think we'll call it. Do you have any recommendations? Of course, your books, so please, you know, let us know, name your books for us. But in addition to what you've authored, do you have any other recommendations on books that folks can read on the subject?
Yeah, I would say anything by Denise Brennan, anything by Alicia Peters, anything by Carol Vance, anything by Martina Vandenberg. My book titles, yes. So my first book, which was on Iran, it was called Passionate Uprisings, Iran Sexual Revolution, Stanford Press. My second book is called Gridlock, Trafficking and Labor and Migration in Dubai. So it's very focused on Dubai. It's also Stanford University Press. My third book is called From Trafficking to Terror, Constructing a Global Social Problem. That's Routledge Press. And then my 2016 book is called Crossing the Gulf, Love and Family in Migrants' Lives, also Stanford Press.
Okay, and on a related note, maybe for some of our folks in the audience who prefer their education in a different medium, the question comes: are there any movies or documentaries which you know, that you recommend that tell these stories in a very meaningful and impactful way that, you know, again, can kind of broaden horizons and help open people's eyes? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a movie called Mammoth. Great movie. I would watch that. Okay. Other than that movie, I mean, there's a lot of documentaries. I would say any documentary that's written, that's done by a scholar as opposed to like an actress. Like Ashley Judd thought she was going to be really big in anti-trafficking, and she hadn't done the depth of the research. So I would say that's done by a scholar. And then, you know, there are a lot of radio and blogs. So I would enter the blogosphere, actually, because a lot of survivors write about their experiences, and nothing, you know, who better to get the story from than somebody who's lived through it.
That's fantastic. And, you know, I've said this a couple times, but this is really going to be the last question because I want to make sure I get everybody's questions answered. From Nushin in Colorado, one of your old stomping grounds. The question comes: it seems our lifestyle of fast fashion and throwaway lifestyle is feeding into this demand. What can we do to stop this cycle? Yeah,
I mean, you're absolutely right, Nushin Jun. I mean, we are feeding the beast, like I said. I mean, what can we do? We can educate ourselves on the supply chains, and we can be really mindful about, you know, how much we buy and what we buy. You know, I think 2020, one of the few silver linings about this year is, you know, it has really made so clear to everyone the very real, you know, triple pandemics, the connections between health, social justice, climate, right? And so think about the beginning of the pandemic when most of us couldn't get toilet paper because a set of people were like hoarding it, right? Or, you know, the shelves were empty and things of that nature. I mean, that's not mindful consumption. And so I do feel like for a period of time while the grocery stores were getting to be restocked, everybody was really mindfully consuming, right? It was like, you would use that, you know, bottle of soap till the very last drop. You wouldn't throw it out when the pump stopped working, and you know, you would be really mindful about your consumption, and that's the kind of thing we need to be doing more often. You know, is being mindful about how much we use and what we use, and really where our things come from, because you know that food, that meal that's on your table for dinner tonight, it was put there sometimes by people who suffered a great deal to get it there. So let's try to reward companies who be really intentional about treating workers fairly so that, you know, we can move forward in a more positive way.
And on that note, that ties into actually the really very last question. Are you hopeful? I mean, are you hopeful that we're moving in the right direction?
I would say I'm cautiously optimistic. I think it's possible. I think the fact that there's such an appetite to educate ourselves about this, that does give me hope. So events like this, when I get such thoughtful questions, that gives me a lot of hope.
That's wonderful. Well, Dean, Dr. Mahdavi, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us tonight. It was a pleasure for me. I've learned a lot. I hope that many of our viewers and listeners have learned a lot. And we hope to have you back for another webinar as soon as you'll have us.
Would love to. Really, it was an honor to be with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.